anyone who comes later can find a seat for themselves. So I wanted to introduce you to Bob McMurray. We've brought him up here to talk about some collaboration opportunities, but we're also happy to have him give a talk for us. Just as a brief introduction, he got his PhD from University of Rochester in Brain and Cognitive Sciences in 2004. He's now at the University of Iowa, and he's an associate professor there. He's received a number of honors, including recognition of Excellence Prize at the Learning to Attend and Attending to Learn workshop, most recently in 2013. He has over 50 peer-reviewed publications, and his focus is on various things. He had worked on some infant development stuff, but now is, as far as I understand, really focused on learning and language development across the lifespan. So please help me welcome Bob McMurray.
Thank you guys for having me out. It's been great. Thanks, Cody, for fantastic hospitality and a really great visit so far. It's been a lot of fun to be in the desert thinking about the rain. Before I start into my spiel, I want to actually thank the people that made all the work possible and really did all the work rather than waiting till the end. And I want to just highlight a couple people in particular. Ariane Rowan is a postdoc. She's from Maryland and she's in my lab. And she was really responsible for a lot of the electrocorticography work that you're going to see today. Ashley Harris-Trimble was another postdoc in my lab. She's now a professor at Simon Fraser, and she was responsible with some guidance from Bruce Tomlin and Karen Kirk for the cochlear implant work you're going to see today. And Matt Howard is the neurosurgeon who runs the neurosurgery group, the ECOG group in Iowa. And really, without his skilled hands and impressive brain, we would not be doing any of this work. And I think the most important person to thank is Bruce Tomlin, who's a professor in communication sciences and disorders at Iowa, and his perspective on individual differences sort of reigns through this talk, as you'll see, and he really made it possible, a lot of the work with kids with SLI and with cochlear implants. So I was trained over 10 years ago as a cognitive scientist. We were taught to bring together neuroscience and psychology and linguistics, philosophy, computer science, and to do that, to sort of make just basic theoretical headway on how the brain works, how the mind works, how people solve cognitive problems like speech perception or visual attention. I was also trained as a developmental scientist, and a developmental scientist in developmental systems theory. The idea that development doesn't just unfold on its own time course, it's a constant interplay between genes and cells and the brain and behavior and the environment, which changes behavior, which changes the brain, which changes cells, which changes gene expression. And at every step of the way, we've got to be looking for multiple causes, multiple effects, and a sort of cyclic interactive process. But what I was really trained to do was study Bas and Pas. I've spent about, 10, 15 years of my life with the mysteries of Bas and Pas. This is a Ba. You can't recognize the spectrum. This is a Pa. They differ by about 40 milliseconds of what we call voice onset time. It's right there. It's really fairly dry and esoteric unless you're me. And I've done, maybe 15 studies looking at, really using Bas and Pas to look at basic issues in auditory perception, speech and language, speech production, that sort of thing. And I did that because language is really quite fundamental to everything in the cognitive sciences. I mean, obviously it's something that's unique to humans. We've yet to train any animals to do anything approaching language, although I think it's important to point out that animals seem to have all the parts. Whenever we identify some critical part of language, like recursion or categorical perception or statistical learning, we find some animal model that an animal can do that part. So there's this big mystery as to what are they lacking, because it doesn't seem like they're lacking anything except for language. The other reason I think language is interesting is language is a cognitive process that you don't do by yourself for the most part, right? It's a cognitive process at its core, and that's how I study it, but it's really meant for a social function, for how people interact with each other, right? So it's this sort of intersection domain. And as a social function and as a cognitive process, it's also related to lots of important things like academic outcomes and just basic well-being. And it's also a function of culture, right? What is a language like English or Bengali or Spanish, but an expression of a culture, right? And things like cultural evolution come to shape the social function, which comes to shape the cognitive process. So language is sort of an interesting domain if you're a very rich interactionist like me. But I think the most important reason I started down the road of studying language was that language encapsulates all the fundamental debates in the cognitive sciences. Things like nature versus nurture, the embodiment of cognition, the linkages between perception and action, the rich debates between symbolic systems versus statistical learning systems, and things like the role of culture. But when I moved to Iowa, I discovered there's another reason to study language, and it's one that we've been writing in the bottom of our grants for 10 years, but we never considered, which is that language is really important to understand in clinical populations. Take, for example, specific language impairment. Specific language impairment is just a generalized deficit in language, and I'm going to tell you a lot more about it later. SLI affects between 8 and 10% of children. That's enormous. That's way more than kids on the autism spectrum. It's way more than kids with Down syndrome. It's largely unrecognized, but it's an extraordinarily common developmental disorder. But it's also comorbid with everything. Kids with autism typically show clinical indications of SLI. Kids with ADHD, almost half of them have SLI and vice versa. That's the same with reading disability or dyslexia. And so this is really a profoundly important thing. And as a cognitive scientist, I was taught to write in my introductions that language is enormously complex, and yet remarkably, most people do it effortlessly. And when I came to Iowa and started working with clinical folks, I realized how absolutely idiotic that was, right? Most people do not do it effortlessly, and we're lucky if we can. But of course, SLI isn't the only problem. Many people face hearing impairments. Speech production disorders are incredibly common in children. Aphasia, right? I could go on and on, right? Almost every clinical population that might be interesting. Language is at least part of it. And that's probably because language encapsulates and brings together so much of cognition and social behavior. And language is even highly correlated with nonverbal IQ. If you're a modularist, you like to think, well, there's language and there's nonverbal IQ. But this is an epidemiological sample of over 500 children. And you can see that performance IQ and language are highly related. This is a correlation of 0.7, which is the test-retest reliability on a lot of clinical language measures. So these are non-independent constructs. I'm not necessarily going to argue for some strong Worfian view of the system either, but this just speaks to the importance. So, okay, I was a cognitive scientist, and this is what I used to think. But thinking about this, I realized this beautiful fleur-de-lis is missing a lot of things. It's missing things like neurology and speech pathology and clinical psychology and otolaryngology. And when you add these, things get to be a little messy. Now, from that perspective, research in many domains of language, both the cognitive sciences and the clinical sciences, often treats language in terms of something fixed. We talk about children knowing words, right, or having the rules of their language. If we're a clinician, we might talk about somebody who scores at -1 standard deviation on a measure of vocabulary. It's treated as static, it's fixed, it's knowledge, right? Linguists do this, right? Do kids know the rules of grammar? What are the rules of grammar? But let's think about that for a second. Let's take a standard sort of clinical assessment, like the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, where all you're trying to do is figure out how many words the kid knows, right? Well, how does this test work? Well, first you say a word, and then you give them an array of pictures, and the kid points. Fine, right? But in between this and that is a lot of really complicated stuff, right? It takes kids about a second to a second and a half to respond, and that's on a computer-based task. If there's some other examiner there, it's going to take a lot longer. It doesn't take that long because you're retrieving knowledge. It takes that long because something really interesting and complex is going on. So instead, if you just think about this simple example, what looks like a stable trait or some kind of abstract knowledge structure actually emerges in the moment in very complex dynamics. And the goal of my talk today is to suggest to you that we might make more headway in understanding both neuroscience and clinical disorders of language by examining these dynamics more directly. So rather than saying how many words does a kid know this aspect of language, looking at how they use words and how they use language. So the talk is going to go in 3 parts. In the first part, I just want to introduce you to the very small and limited domain of language I'm going to work on, which is spoken word recognition. And I want to sort of justify it as a model system for thinking about dynamics. I'm then going to go into a bunch of work from electrocorticography revealing something about the neural basis of these dynamics, where they show up in the brain, how they show up in the brain, and what that can tell us about the basic process. And then I want to run through a number of clinical studies looking at children with SLI, children and adults who use cochlear implants, and typically developing children, to show how understanding language as a dynamic process can actually change our view in the clinic. So let's just start with spoken word recognition. Like I said before, the fundamental process of language is temporal, right? We can record a sound. I don't even know what sound this is anymore. I used to know. It looks like it might be seat, actually, if I read the spectrogram right. And here's the waveform. This is the actual air pressure hitting the ear. This is a spectrogram. We've got time coming in, frequency and energy. You can see these lovely little glottal vibrations. That's the E. You can hear this very high frequency, right? Not very regular. And we look at this and we can say that's the word seat, as I just did, right? Or you can look at a written text. But this is not at all how the ear and the brain hear language. This is really what the brain gets, right? And somehow from that, you have to recover this picture. That's just unavoidable. In written language, it's not. In written language, people tend to fixate and view a whole word, you get all the information simultaneously. In spoken language, you get this. So this is the big theoretical issue in the cognitive psychology of word recognition, time. How do people deal with this? The information comes in sequentially, and as William Marsland Wilson pointed out, at early points in time, it's completely ambiguous. You might get bay, right? You haven't heard the rest of the word. It could be basic, bakery, bacon, that's my favorite, bake, barricade, baby, whatever. And you don't find out which it is until later, right, when you get Korean. And you're disappointed because it wasn't bacon. So the later information kind of disambiguates the words. This has been framed as a problem of temporary ambiguity. Now, you can ask, when would a listener commit, right? That's the big question. So one strategy when you're dealing with temporary ambiguity would be just to wait, right? I mean, why bother doing anything at all? So you hear bake, stick it in a memory buffer. You hear bake, stick it in a memory buffer. When you get read, then you go, right? Now, here's the problem. It's uncertain when a word even ends. So take a word like hamster. Well, there's another word inside of it. Do you commit at the end of ham? Do you wait till you get stir? Dennis Norris has the example of shipping inquiry, where it could be ship in quietly, shipping quietly, ship inquiry. It's so ambiguous. So there's never a clear point in the signal where you can say, let's go. Now the other thing is, if you're engaged in real-time conversation with somebody, what do you do while you wait? You've just heard the beginning of a word, you're thinking to yourself, can't say anything at this point. Are you going to wait 400 or 500 milliseconds till the end? No, it would be helpful if, while you were listening to the beginning of the word, you had some inkling what the other person was saying. So the other option would be to make partial early commitments. That is, maybe you hear bay, you say, it could be bakery, it could be bacon, it's definitely not sandwich, right? And you're starting to get some idea. Now this would be very fast and it won't always be accurate, right? At the beginning of a word, you won't always know. So you have to keep your options open as the input unfolds. But it also means you don't have to know exactly when a word ends. Just accumulate information until you have enough. Now both of these require pretty different cognitive processes to do, right? This one's going to require sort of a echoic memory of some sort to remember everything you've heard. This one is going to be some sort of integration competition. So it kind of matters which you choose. Now the current consensus after maybe 30 years of research in spoken word recognition is very clear. Early commitments. This is the story. I think there's almost nobody in psycholinguistics who would disagree with this. And what happens is, as soon as you get any input, you activate in parallel multiple options just slightly. So you might hear S and you activate soup, sandal, and sack. You're activating multiple items. You're not activating candle or dog. When you get the A, you can rule out soup, right? But you might start to build a little activation for candle. And as the input unfolds, you get this very dynamic, very graded competition process. And so by the end, you just get one word. So this is sort of the consensus. I wrote this like 20-page introduction to a paper once saying this, and the reviewer wrote back one word, introduction, duh. Right? There's no like ambiguity on this. I don't know who that reviewer was. It's brilliant. We all agree with this. Now, why do we agree with this? Well, one way you can measure this process is to use a procedure called the visual world paradigm. And this was one that was developed at Rochester about almost 20 years ago now. And I was lucky to be there near the beginning. I really take no credit for this. And it's very, very clever. And the idea is that subjects would hear spoken language, like a word, or sentence, or paragraph, or whatever, and their job is to manipulate real objects in the visual world. Sometimes you do it with real objects on a table, sometimes you do it on a computer screen, sometimes it's during interactive dialogue. We simplify it down to a computer screen because we're studying very low-level aspects of language. Now, the items in the visual world include objects that have interesting linguistic properties. So in this case, to study this problem, I might include a sandal, a sandwich, a candle, and an unrelated item. So all they do is they hear sandal and they point at it or they click on it. That's it. That's the whole task. It's trivially easy. But in order to do that, you have to launch an eye movement. The sandal isn't always in the same location. There's multiple trials with different objects from trial to trial. And in order to figure out where to click, I first got to look. And that means I have to activate the meaning of the word, because it's not an orthography of sandal out there. It's a picture of a sandal. So your eye movements tell us what people are thinking before they ever can. Let me give you an idea of what a trial might look like. Here's the trial I just described with a sandal, a sandwich, a candle, and a necklace. That's our unrelated object. And they'll see them for about 500 milliseconds, maybe 1,000. This little dot turns red. They click on it. They then hear the word sandal, and they go from there. And then you repeat this thousands of times, maybe with different items, right? So that's it. It's very, very simple. Now, why would you do this? Well, the first thing is it's extraordinarily natural. Unlike everything else you do in language where you ask people to make discriminations or word judgments, this is something that we do every day. If I say pizza, all of you guys are looking at the pizza. And if not, you've eaten yours. I'm jealous. And so this is measuring language function, and it's very simple, and as a result, it's very easy to use with clinical populations. And in the last 10 years, you've seen an explosion of it. Children with dyslexia, children with autism, people with aphasia, children with SLI. And what we found when we do it is these people who maybe have SLI, they've been tested years and years and years on stuff that's very hard. It's always frustrating to go and see the examiner. They love our experiments. You just had to hear the word and click on it, right? They can perform in ceiling on these, even as their eye movements that you'll see will tell us something quite different. Now the other thing that's great about this is eye movements are generated very fast. If I put you in a dark room and flash a light, 200 milliseconds later, you will look at that light. We find that people make eye movements that are related to what they're hearing within about 200 to 250 milliseconds after word onset. And so these eye movements tell us what people are thinking very, very early in the process. And as a result, they're time-locked to speech. The eye movement that you launched 200 milliseconds after hearing sad really just reflects sad, doesn't reflect the end of the word. The eye movement you launched 500 milliseconds is starting to reflect the anda, right? And the eye movement at the end reflects what you've committed to. Subjects are typically not aware of this. They just think they're doing a trivially easy task. Some of them even ask, why did you want me to do that? I've had fights with subjects about what they looked at. They don't believe it that they do some of these things. It's quite fun. And over lots and lots of studies, we've shown that this technique maps quite closely onto the concept of lexical activation. And I'm going to use that concept a lot. All that means is sort of like how strongly you're considering a word. So when you hear sandal, how strongly are you considering sandwich? That's how active it is. And there's lots of things that we know from other paradigms that affect lexical activation, like word frequency, that sort of thing. This seems to fit all of those properties. Now, eye movements, however, are not continuous. The kind of eye movements people make in our task are usually a series of discrete sort of fixations. So, for example, on a trial like this, where we've got a target sandal and a cohort, that's a word that overlaps an onset, like sandwich, and a rhyme. We might see one trial where they just fixate the sandal, right? And another one where maybe they briefly fixate the candle and then back to the sandal. Another one where they go sandal, sandwich, sandal, right? And across thousands of trials, you get all the possible permutations. What we do is we average within tiny little time slices, but across all of those trials. And you can kind of come up with the smooth proportion of fixating something at any given time. And this is what really maps on to that unfolding dynamic process. So you can see here, early on, they're looking at the candle and the sandal. That's actually not right. That should probably be the sandwich. And then it gradually cuts off. They gradually converge on the sandal. So these are data from a study that we conducted just a few years ago. These are representative of lots of studies. Paulo Alpena was the first one to do this. The subject heard sandal, or they heard beaker, they heard lots of different target words, and we monitored their fixations. The first 300 milliseconds are nothing here. It takes 200 milliseconds to plan an eye movement, and there was 100 milliseconds at the beginning of the word. So this is sort of the first point in time where you would expect to see anything you cared about. And you can see that right around that point in time, they're fixating the sandal and the sandwich, and they're not fixating the candle or the necklace. You can see about 600 milliseconds, they've heard bowl at this point. They've started to rule out sandwich. They're starting to really commit to sandal. And at that point, of course, they're starting to think candle, right? They're sort of hedging their bets. Maybe I didn't hear that S all the way. Maybe it really is a cup. It should be the word candle. This is very consistent with lots and lots of data from lots of different paradigms. And this is why we think that word recognition operates as this early commitment immediate process. Here we are, basically 50, 100 milliseconds after the beginning of the word, and people have already accessed the potential meanings, right? They're already looking at pictures of sandals and sandwiches. Now, people, this is not limited to sandals and sandwiches. People went crazy examining lots of different factors, like word frequency, having a sentence before you, semantic factors. You can get people to hear lock and look briefly at the key. You can manipulate the fine-grained acoustics to look at how auditory perceptual processes change this. That's been a big undertaking in my lab. You can manipulate temperature. It just goes on and on. I'm not going to give you this lengthy review of all that because I think it would bore you. But the idea is this is just sort of a very flexible way to get at lots and lots of issues. And what I'm showing you today is a very simple version of it that we've applied to a number of clinical populations. And the bottom line from all these studies is that a wide variety of factors, both cognitive factors like semantics and stimulus factors, impact these real-time dynamics, but always in different ways. Right? Always in different ways. So this early commitment model then is very simple. As soon as you hear the beginning of a word, listeners make partial commitments at the level of word meaning, right? They're already activating the potential meaning of these words within a few hundred milliseconds. These commitments are dynamic and partial. There's this sort of competition process between items, and eventually one is resolved. This is not unique to eye movements. You can see this in gating tasks and cross-modal priming and all sorts of other things. So if you look back at the story for word recognition, we have a pretty clear theoretical consensus about the basic properties and how it works. And with this pretty interesting measure, right, in the visual world paradigm. So in that way, for the purpose of today's talk, spoken word recognition is a pretty nice sort of model system for thinking about how to look at dynamics in the brain, how to look at it in clinical populations. So now I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the brain. We know a lot about the various brain areas involved with language. If you look at this sort of textbook image here, it's almost all of it. Right? And every day, sort of new little pockets show up as useful for one thing or another. But what we don't know is much about this process of dynamically committing to words over time works, right? Most of this is done with MRI or with phagics, that's a very slow time course. We just simply haven't gotten down into the millisecond by millisecond process. And I think this is really important for a couple of reasons. One is that this might illuminate how auditory processing works more generally, right? And there's lots of reasons to care about that. For example, word recognition requires lots of memory, so we can ask, where's memory built into the system? How do non-auditory areas, like the inferior frontal gyrus, which we'll get to, interact with auditory areas, like Heschel's gyrus? How do these things get put together? I think this is also going to impact cognitive models. I was trained as basically a cognitive scientist, not a neuroscientist, and I see in the brain places where our models fall apart. For example, the Hickok and Popple model posits multiple routes of recognizing words. There's not a single cognitive model that has multiple routes of recognizing words, right? So just right there's a real disconnect, and we need to understand this. But of course, the other reason you want to do this is this might be essential for understanding clinical or developmental disorders that involve language, understanding the basic brain mechanisms. So here's what we do know in a very early nutshell. Heschel's gyrus, if you're not an auditory person, is one of the first stops after the thalamus. It's where auditory information first hits the cortex. It's underneath this lobe here. This is the superior temporal gyrus. It's kind of behind it. It's not on top like this little text says. And it does most very early. Auditory processing areas, the core and the belt, if you're into that, are there. It's not particularly specialized for speech. You can get it to fire for just about any auditory input. Now the superior temporal gyrus, which is sort of this broad, sort of wormy shape here, does a little bit more. It seems to be doing something phonological or pre-lexical. There was a Nature paper by Mescarani and Chang recently that found phonemes distributed all over that area. I think that paper's got a lot of problems, but I think there probably are some phonological processes going on there. We've got some work, as well as others, showing that this also sort of seems to sort of a gradient thing. It doesn't necessarily store whether it's a B or a P. It's like how B-like or how P-like is it. And that's a really interesting kind of thing to kind of contrast with the Mescarani story. But I think they both suggest it's doing something pre-lexical, something before you access words. And we do know that if you damage it, some elegant work by Sheila Bloomstein's group, you can get lots and lots of activation for competitors. So people with damage in STG will overactivate samples when they hear samples. They have a hard time dealing with that. Now the other area that's gotten a lot of attention in speech and language is the inferior frontal gyrus, which is sort of up here-ish. And we know that that will be more active if you've got lots of competing words. So if you hear a word like beak that has tons and tons of neighbors like peak and beach, you get a lot of activity there. If you hear a word like squirt that doesn't have very many similar sounding words, you get less. So there's doing something, perhaps lexical. And we know that if you damage it, People adopt a late commitment strategy. People wait until much later in the word. They don't even consider cohort competitors, and they go right to the target. So you might say that competition comes from the bottom-up early processing in STG and Heschel's gyrus, and IFG is suppressing it, right? What we don't know from this story, though, is where are these memory mechanisms? Where's the competition occurring? Is it resolved in IFG, or is IFG like sort of saying, hey, you guys down there in STG, get it together, right? Stop fighting it out, like I do every morning with my children. So this was the sort of issues that we wanted to address in this first study. We wanted to know what information is present in different brain regions during lexical processing. Is there any evidence for self-sustaining or memory representations? What do the later areas like IFG do? What do early areas like Heschel's gyrus do? And then as a bonus question, I'm going to be able to show you some interesting data on hemispheric asymmetries and on attention. These are, however, largely questions of information, not activation. We can't just play some sounds to people and see what areas light up. All these areas are going to light up, right? What we really want to know is what information is in each area. And so to do that, we turn to electrocorticography. We also turn to electrocorticography because it's amazing, and there's a great group at Iowa doing it. But the more reason to do it is that we can get to information. These are people who have intractable epilepsy. They come into the lab or to the operating room because really the only option left to them is to excise the piece of the brain that's causing the seizures. They will likely die early from a disorder that's very similar to sudden infant death syndrome. They can't drive, their seizures are too frequent. So it seems radical to take out oftentimes a whole chunk of the temporal lobe, but it's really the only option left to them. And so they come in, we open up their heads. I don't do this, I'm not qualified. They implant an array of electrodes all over their heads. So here we have a nice array of superior temporal gyrus. We also have, this is Heschel's gyrus, sort of inwards. We can do depth electrodes. We usually do 1 or 2 depth electrodes, so we can get down deep into the cortex to see what's going on. And then they sit in the hospital for about a week or two while we wait for them to have a seizure. At that point, we know what's causing it, and we can open them up again and do the surgery rather. Now, the great thing about this is they're awake. We're measuring directly from the brain. There's no localization issues. This dot is here for more or less. It does shift a little bit. We have to deal with that. And we can pull out measures like high gamma band activity, which I'll describe to you in a second, which are very localized, but also very rapid, right? I mean, we're measuring brain activity as it changes. This is like a local field potential if you're an animal researcher. Now, the stimuli we used in the study were meant to elicit long periods of overlap. They came in triplets, like dinosaur, dynamite, and diary. All those have this nice die at the beginning. Caliber, calorie, and calculate, manatee, manicure, and mandarin. So you've got nice long overlap in all of those. There was lots of different exemplars of dinosaur. We didn't want to be measuring specific brain responses to maybe like a higher pitch in dinosaur or a little pop or something. So we just recorded the word dinosaur 10 times. And every trial is a sort of unique dinosaur. And each of these exemplars are repeated 5 times. We're getting a ton of data from this. Now, we started off with passive listening. Our patients often have headaches. They're often tired. They've just been through brain surgery. So we try to reserve the active tasks for when we're really sure we're going to get something good. And this was a sort of beginning stage, so we did passive. I have one patient that did it in both active mode and passive mode. The results are spectacular. I'll show you that at the end. It's just one patient, so we can't like go crazy over that. Now, the recording sites that we get are based on clinical concerns, right? The surgeons and the neurologists decide where the likely areas are, and that's what we get. But we had great coverage for this study. 3 of our patients had left hemisphere arrays, 3 had right hemisphere arrays. So we're in good shape to talk about hemispheric differences. All 6 had coverage on STG. That's great. 5 also had some coverage for IFG, which is another area we're very interested in. And 5 had, I can't even spell Heschel's right, Heschel's gyrus depth electrodes. So we're getting very early processing for most of them. Here's some brains if you want to take a look. These are our 3 left hemisphere patients. You can see the placement. You can also just admire how different people's brains are, right? When you look at those inflated brains they show you in MRI talks, that's wrong. This is like wild how different they are. And we have to go through brain by brain and try to mark up where the areas are, which electrodes we're interested in. Here's our right hemisphere patients, all different arrays, all different grades. Now, just to give you a rough sort of semblance of what's the processing stream we're interested in, right? We think that auditory information comes in at Heschel's gyrus, so that's these electrodes here that are kind of back there-ish. I'm pushing it forward, but I know the little dot doesn't get bigger, but it's down in there, right? I can drill a hole through your screen. And then it splits up. We've subdivided STG into STG and PLST. This is sort of like anterior and posterior, and it sort of spawns off there, goes to both of them. And then PLST areas go back to supramarginal gyrus, and STG sort of hooks up to the inferior frontal gyrus. This is way oversimplified, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so just bear with me on that. We can kind of mark them on any individual brain, and that's what we do. You can see how we mark the different electrode sites. The other thing I think that's really interesting is some emerging work from our group and lots of others suggests that this is really a core auditory area. It's one of the very first pathways. This is doing something qualitatively different. And so for some of the analogies, I separated medial Heschel's gyrus from lateral Heschel's gyrus. Because this we can clearly say is early, and this is ambiguous. It's doing something a little bit different and a little bit later. We have a paper coming out in cerebral cortex soon that kind of walks you through that. So this is the kind of data we get. It's immense, right? This is just part of the temporal grid for one subject. These are just the voltages over time in our different brain areas. You can see STG gives you something that looks like an N1, P2 type complex, right? That sort of makes sense. That's what you would see with MEG or ERPs and so forth. And there's activity everywhere. We can also take the same brain activity and do a time frequency analysis. That just says, as the voltage is changing over time, how quickly or slowly is it changing? So here we have time and here we have frequency. We get this blob of low frequency change. That's these big, slow changes that you can actually see. But we also get this blob up here, very high frequency changes. That's the sort of jitter, right? And that's the high gamma band responding, which we think reflects localized neural firing. So that's something you can say these neurons under this recording site are firing, maybe, right? To the extent that we can say anything. Now we can do a time frequency analysis on all of these. And you get gigabytes and gigabytes and gigabytes of data. It's way too much for one person. This, for example, is just the gamma band activity in each of the brain areas over time, averaged across our subjects. So you can see lots of activity in STG, in posterior, lateral superior temporal, so basically posterior STG, supramarginal, IFG gets some, Heschel's gyrus, and so forth. But this isn't what we're interested in. We don't want to show that there's like more brain activity when you hear calorie than calculate. There's not. That's ridiculous, right? What we really want to know is if a particular brain area knows whether the word was calorie or calculate. Is it coding the difference, right? It could be that one electrode's a little bit higher for calculating, the other one's for caliber, right? Could be some weird nonlinear pattern. But we want to know if the distribution of activity across all those electrodes differs, because that tells us that that brain area is responding differently to those two words, or those three words. So the degree to which we can predict which word a participant heard from the pattern of activity in a brain area tells us how distinctly words are encoded in that area. If we can't, even if the brain area is firing, it may not actually know which word it is. It might be saying, I got language, I got language, I got language, right? And that's all it really knows. So here's how we do that. We take a little patch like STG, we'll grab one electrode site and we'll do lots of different things like gamma band activity, raw voltage, the change in voltage, beta band activity, and so forth. We cycle through all the activities and we lump all those together and we run it through a support vector machine. A support vector machine is a very complicated piece of computer science. What it does is it takes a bunch of inputs in a vastly high dimensional space and tries to find category boundaries. That's all it does. I can go through the math if you want, but you really don't. And so we train these SVMs to simply output the categories. If you've got a problem with SVM, if you're a computer scientist, we've also done this to a smaller extent with other techniques like sparse logistic regression. It all looks about the same. And we're going to ask this SVM just to tell us which of the 9 words you heard. Did you hear manatee? Did you hear dynamite? Did you hear calorie? We're going to repeat this every 25 milliseconds in little time windows so we can actually visualize what word the brain thinks it's hearing every 25 milliseconds and in each brain area. And how much information, that is how accurate we are classifying at a given time in a given brain area, tells us what the participant is thinking. So just to remind you, these are the eye movement results. It looks to the target, like manicure, looks to the goer, like manatee, looks to unrelated objects. Just fix that in your brain. Because here is classification performance averaged across all the language electrodes. You get accuracy identified for the target, briefly consider the cohort, stop considering the unrelated. It looks very, very similar. You guys see it? I know the baseline is chance, not 0, but other than that, this is about the same thing. So now, we've shown that as a whole, this constellation of areas seems to be doing something that looks like lexicodynamics. And I should point out, this is averaged across all of our patients, but each individual patient shows the exact same result. These are very consistent across patients. So let's dig in a little bit. Let's start with superior temporal chakras. That's sort of the classic speech area. We should start there. We see basically the same thing. Now, a couple of interesting things to note here, though. This is the offset of the word. Remember, the words are variable, so there's lots of different offsets. This is a standard deviation. This is the absolute latest word. And you can see, well after offset for most words, and even after the last possible offset, we're still identifying the target above chance. And we've done Monte Carlos to show that that's actually above chance. It really is. Which means there's a lot of memory. There's no more auditory input coming in, and this area of the brain still knows what the target word was. Similar when we look at PLST, so both parts of superior temporal gyrus are doing this quite well. What we see are very strong immediate effects of temporary ambiguity. Whether it's manatee or manicure, the brain doesn't know, but it knows it's one of those two. Early confusion with the cohort, and then this is suppressed as the word unfolds. We also see some memory for the target work well after offset, particularly in STG. So now let's ask what happens earlier. When we look at Heschel's gyrus, it looks exactly the same. In fact, it looks even better. Look at the performance out here at word offset. Heschel's gyrus is doing a great job here. The same conclusions apply. Strong immediate effects of temporary ambiguity, some confusion that's suppressed, some memory. We might say, well, what about lateral HG? Maybe that's like a later area. Let's look at just the core areas. So we restrict our analysis to the core areas, we look exactly the same. So we're getting very robust information that's pretty reflective of lexical competition dynamics in almost the first cortical stop. And this kind of fits with some of the work that Ian Krauss has been doing, showing there's a lot of subcortical language processing going on, or speech processing of speech. So maybe we've been thinking about these in the wrong way. So okay, the dynamics of lexical activation can be observed, or something very much like them, in very early auditory processing. And what that suggests to me is that lexical processing, recognizing a word, is not necessarily distinct from auditory processing. These are part and parcel of the same mechanism. And that's a very different view than, for example, people in SLI or people who use cochlear implants take. It's a two-stage model, right? First you identify the phonemes, then you identify the words. Or maybe first you do some kind of auditory scene analysis, and then you identify the phonemes, and then you identify the words. That's not happening here. We're seeing them all at the same time. But what about later in the processing chain? So now we look at inferior frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus knows nothing. It's very bad. It knows that it's manicure or manatee shortly, and if I ask it to identify which of the three sets it's doing, is it the manatee set, the diary set, the calorie set, it's good at that. It cannot figure out which word was the winner, right? So it seems to know that there was competition without knowing what the results of the competition were. Supramarginal is the exact same. So these brain areas do not contain enough information to distinguish the words, right? I think what that tells us is they are responsive to the amount of competition, but this isn't where the competition is resolving, right? And that would actually fit with a lot of the developmental data on frontal lobe function, right? Frontal lobe function is sort of like, goes back to the relevant processing areas, like in the A-not-B task, for example. It's sorted out, even though that's not where the sorting is going. They also don't have strong memory functionality, at least in this paradigm. So this is the overall accuracy across the different brain areas, just for finding the right words. Just kind of fix this in your mind. You got great results from STG and PLST, really good results from Heschel's, not much for IFG and SNG. Now we can ask, where is it different across the hemispheres? So we've only got 3 patients with each hemisphere, which is huge for an ECOG study, but it's nothing for anybody else, right? So take this with a grain of salt. And here's what we see. We see that both the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere patients look pretty much the same. And the one difference, though, is Heschel's gyrus. In the left hemisphere, Heschel's is responding less well than STG and PLST. In the right hemisphere, it's responding much better. And what that suggests to me, if I squint at it and think really carefully, is the right hemisphere is processing this in a more auditory framework. Heschel's gyrus, very precise auditory representations, and we're discriminating these words at a more auditory level, but it's not so good at speech on the right hemisphere, the STG and PLST. The flip side is true here, where STG and PLST seem to be improving on the information that's in Heschel's gyrus, probably because they're doing some kind of speech, lexical, phonological analysis. Now, the last finding, which really blew my mind, but it's only one subject, so this is a problem even for the ECOG people, was patient 258. Patient 258 was one of the last ones we ran, and we got him to do the task once. First he did it like everybody else, passive listening, hear the word, measure the brain. But next we had him do it in active mode. Now active mode is pretty trivial. He hears a word, diary, he sees 2 words on the screen, randomly selected, and he points at which one it is, right? So it's barely anything. This is not what I would call attention, but it is some kind of focus, it is some sort of active processing. Look at the difference. This is all the electrodes right now, target, cohort, and rhyme, and you can see in active mode, the information is far superior, but only for the target. The competitors are briefly activated about the same amount. What attention is doing here is it's ramping up your ability to let that target win, right? To help that target win. And I think that's really kind of interesting. Now, look what happens in medial Heschel's gyrus, the lowest point of cortical like auditory processing. The effect is even better. Without attention, in this particular patient, There's very little discrimination in target from cohort. But with attention, you get this gorgeous lexical dynamics and great memory, even in Heschel's gyrus after word onset. So, to conclude from this study, what information is present in various brain regions during the dynamics of word recognition? One, it's pure temporal gyrus, PLST, pretty complete record. That seems to be where it's happening. And even medial Heschel's gyrus shows enough information to look like an activation model of word recognition. IFG and SMG do not contain enough information to do this. This is not where it's happening. It's happening earlier. Where is there evidence for memory? Well, early in the processing chain. STG and Heschel's gyrus in particular, particularly Heschel's gyrus, we can see strong evidence for memory. What's the role of the later areas? I'm not sure. These are obviously sensitive to competition to some degree. I don't know if they play a causal role in suppressing it. They might. The patient studies suggest something is different when those are ablated. Maybe they send an inhibitory signal. Maybe they play some memory role. We don't know yet. We're still trying to sort that out. But the converse is that lexical activation, lexical competition seems to be resolved in lower level areas, the same areas that are supposed to be doing auditory processing. Again, this is not a two-stage process. The hemisphere differences hint that the right hemisphere might be doing some sort of enhanced auditory encoding of the signal, and the left area seems to do linguistic coding, particularly in the later cortical regions like SDG and PLST. And attention seems to magnify the brain areas, magnify the information in all the brain areas we've observed. Is there any evidence for specifically lexical representations? Maybe not. Maybe these brain areas are literally encoding what's in the signal, and they're just responding to overlap in the signal. I'm not sure that you can justify that in this case. For one case, we have multiple exemplars, so they have to be doing a fairly gross feature coding at least. It's not pure auditory, because the exemplars differ. Maybe you could make that argument in Heschel's gyrus, but in the logical regions of STG and PLST, it's not clear that they do it. I think the role of attention, particularly in Heschel's gyrus, says there's something different going on. And if you want to say that these are all auditory, then somewhere else must be lexical. And we didn't find any evidence of that in the later brain areas, right? So I think we can't rule it out, but we also don't want to make it into a too strong of a claim. But the bottom line is that brain activity is immediately responsible for the dynamics of lexical competition in areas that are thought to be primarily auditory. And the other bottom line, though, is that information in the brain is not isomorphic with activation. This is gamma responding to each of those areas, and we were getting good discrimination out here, in fact, better discrimination out here than we were here, right? The gamma band activity is a product of a lot of things, right? And by looking at information, we got a very different story. So now I want to move on to clinical groups and talk a little bit about what this real-time view of word recognition means for people facing communication difficulties. At the face level, real-time dynamics might offer a more precise framing for understanding the neural basis of words. I think I just showed you that. We got a very different view of it by looking there. Could they help us with communicative disorders? And so this long-term research project that I've been engaged in is examining these real-time dynamics in lots of different populations. Adolescents with SLI or language impairment, typically developing adolescents, people use cochlear implants, children use cochlear implants. We're going to be moving into some limited aphasia work soon. We'd like to move into some reading disorders work as well, but we haven't gotten there yet. I'll just give you a warning. We don't have ECOG data on any of these people, so it's going to be behavioral work, although there was one cochlear implant user who we recently saw in the lab, so that would be fascinating. But the big question is here, if we examine real-time processing, can we get a different sense of the contributions of developmental, perceptual, and language factors to these groups? I want to start with specific language impairment. Specific language impairment is a generalized deficit in language at all levels. It's just basically your -1 standard deviation or below on standardized language measures, but without any other causal factors like you have a normal nonverbal IQ, no hearing impairment, no developmental disorders, no neurological disorders, and so forth. We can also talk about non-specific language impairment. These are SLI kids that also have poor IQ. Most kids with poor language have poor IQ, so this is an equally large and important group. Now, this group has primarily been defined with respect to morphosyntactic skills. They have a hard time with verb endings, for example. But they're also associated with perceptual deficits, and there's an active debate raging about how important that is. SLI is very stable over development. These are the results of Bruce Tomlin's epidemiological longitudinal sample of about 600 kids in Iowa. These are individual growth curves from kindergarten to the end of high school for individual kids. And you can see these are parallel lines, right? How you score as a 5-year-old in language really predicts how you're going to end up. Now, we're going to study adolescents out here because that's the age these kids were when I got to them. It also makes it very easy to use these sophisticated behavioral measures with them. But it's important to remember, these are the same kids who are going to be SLI down here. Now the other group we look at is people who use cochlear implants. If you're not familiar with a cochlear implant, these are people who are profoundly deaf, and this is an amazing prosthesis which allows them to hear. The idea is sound is picked up by an external microphone. It's sent to a processor. Sometimes you wear the processor down on your waist. This guy has one right behind his ear, which is pretty cool. It's then beamed subcutaneously into an electrode implanted in the cochlea to excite the auditory nerve. Now, the problem is cochlear implants have about 22 electrodes currently. The first ones have 1. The auditory nerve has tens of thousands of hair cells. And so what you end up doing is reducing the precision of frequency encoding. Frequency is encoded as location in the cochlea. These would be high frequencies, these would be low frequencies. So rather than hearing 20,000 different frequencies as the human ear can, people who use cochlear implants can hear 22. Most of them don't even use all their electrodes. They might hear 10 or 15. And that's pretty standard. So we get very degraded speech. This is a spectrogram of a normal word. This is language. This is the spectrogram of what a CI user might hear. You guys aren't going to be able to hear it because I don't have sound, but it sounds like, right? If you've ever watched CSI, the guy on the phone is the bad guy, that's actually doing cochlear implant simulations. It's called noise vocoding. Now, CI outcomes are quite good right now. People who were deafened as adults and then received their implants do great, especially if they have any residual hearing, say in their other ear. At Iowa, we have a hybrid implant now that preserves low-frequency acoustic hearing, and it replaces their electric hearing, their high frequencies with electric hearing. That also is doing quite well. Most people do pretty well with these. Prelingually deafened children, on the other hand, if they're implanted before about 2 years of age, do great. We have a child who was implanted at like 2.5 in our group, who was in the marching band at the University of Iowa, not playing the drums, playing the trumpet. And in many of these individuals that they were implanted early, you can talk to them, you'd never know they were deaf. They don't have a deaf accent, and they're quite comfortable and quite proficient in hearing society. But they're also significantly delayed. In fact, if you look at like language scores, if you stop and you say, let's look at 12-year-olds, you'd say, oh wow, they've got terrible language. We recently showed that if you look out when they're 18 or 20, they start to catch up. So their developmental time course is very, very delayed, but they can get there. Now, if they're implanted later, the results are highly variable. Kids who are implanted at 10 and 11, many of them never really achieve good sound perception at all. And all of this is related to lots of interesting cognitive factors. David Pizzoni's group has been pushing executive function and working memory, and there's a number of others that seem to play a role. Now, the interesting thing about these two groups is they sort of form a soft dissociation. I'm not a big fan of the sort of double dissociation model, but in this case, it kind of works. So language impaired kids, we know they have a language deficit, that's the blue, and they might have a perceptual deficit. That's the sort of state of the literature. Adults who use cochlear implants definitely have a perceptual deficit. We'd like to know about higher level language. And kids are a wild card. Kids are probably going to be impaired as well. So let's start with the SLI studies. This was a study Bruce Tomlin and I did about 4 years ago. We studied 4 groups of children, kids with SLI and typically developing controls. We also did kids with NLIs. These are kids with poor language and poor IQ. And then just for good measure, we have specific cognitive impaired kids, kids who have good language but poor IQ, right? They're sort of the opposite of SLI. So we've got the whole space sampled. And we drove around Iowa in these beautiful vans. We had our undergraduate research assistants pull up in a big white van with curtains and pick some kid up off the street that we had identified as SLI, shuffle them in the back. They would leave with some money, and in between them, we were collecting eye tracking data. So there's our eye tracking in the van. We did the same paradigm I showed you at the beginning, where they would get words like sandal and sandwich and candle. In fact, that data I showed you was the control group from this study. 41, we made sure the kids knew all the words in advance. All of the items would show up as targets. So sometimes you get the sandal as the target, and they get the sandwich and so forth. This is the accuracy data. You can see that all 4 groups did great, above 98%, right? Reaction times are pretty typical. The kids with NLI were slower than the others, but there weren't really any differences here. Now, here's the normal data again, the typically developing kid data again. You can see just like we expect, looks to the target in the cohort is suppressed, Brian is fixated, right? These are the worst of the worst, the NLI kids. It looks about the same, right? It looks about the same. There's not a qualitative difference in word recognition between these kids. But when we line up the curves on top of each other, we see something quite different. For the typically developing kids and the SCI kids, the 2 groups of kids with good language, they peak a lot higher than the 2 groups of kids with poor language. At the end of processing, not at the early parts. The early parts look pretty similar. And this is really apparent if you look at their looks to the cohort. Here, everybody looks at the cohort about the same amount. But particularly the NLI kids can't stop looking at it. These are trials in which they clicked the sandal, and they are still fixating the sandwich. They can't get sandwiches out of their head. Or any other cohort, it's not just about food. Here's the same with the candle, right? They hear the sandwich, the sandal, and they can't get the candle out of their head. It's like they have a failure to suppress this all the way. We didn't see any effects of IQ. What we saw instead was at the end of the time course, people with SLI or NLI were not fixating the target as much, and they were fixating the cohort rhyme a lot more. Even on the trials where the LI listeners selected the correct object, 10% of the time they were simultaneously fixating something else. That blew our mind. We thought there was a problem with the eye tracker. We're going to go back and check the eye tracker. It's not. It looks like these particular children can't fully suppress the wrong interpretation. So if we think about word recognition as this competition process between partially active items, the winners can't win all the way, right? The losers don't go away. They still hang around. Now, we ran a computational model of word recognition. We tried to break it in like 25 different ways to see, well, what would cause this pattern of activity? I'm not going to get into all the math. What we found was it was decay. Of all the different ways to break it, the only one that worked was that as you're activating a target word, it decays. It's like it can't sustain itself in working memory. We can look later on. We looked at whether is this an auditory problem. So we manipulated one of the auditory cues to these words. You can see that both groups are similarly sensitive to the auditory cue. It's not that they have a different slow cue, but one of them looks more. Again, I can talk about that study at the end more, but it really suggests this is something going on at the lexical level, not at an auditory level for these kids. So this is evidence for a lexical, not a perceptual deficit in these children. And Kate Nation has a brilliant review article coming out of Philosophical Transactions, where she kind of puts together a whole lot of work to suggest that we've missed it on SLI. That SLI was often thought to be either perceptual or morphosyntactic. Maybe it's about words. But it's also not a deficit of knowledge or representations. It's not that these kids don't know these words. It's about how they use them that's important. Now, I don't want to argue that this is it. This is the whole thing, right? Syntax is very complex, and I don't understand it. Morphology is very complex. Learning processes are very complex. Where do these changes in inhibition or decay even come from? So what we're showing you here is a part of the story at best. But I think it's a big part of the story. Because if you're listening to a whole sentence, and at every word you hear, you can't suppress competing alternatives, by the end of the sentence, you've got a whole bunch of mush in your brain, right? It's going to be very hard to make sense of it. The other way this could be a big deal is that maybe what we've measured here is a very generalized deficit in decay or inhibition. Maybe these kids would also have a hard time inhibiting alternative parses of a sentence, right? Or alternative interpretations of the discourse. And that could explain, for example, Robert Cale's data showing they're also bad at things like visual search that are purely nonverbal. So maybe what we found here is a marker of something that's broad-based. That's about how banks of neurons interact with each other. The other reason this could be important is that in a line of work I'm developing on word learning with Larissa Samuelson, we've shown that how words are processed in the moment changes what is learned. And so if kids are coming to the table with poor learning, they can't suppress speech when they hear peach, for example, right? They may activate both of those meanings to that sound. And now they've got a messy semantic representation. So there's lots of ways where this could be a big deal. But we're not at the point where I want to say there's a single cause here, and I don't think I'd ever want to say that. Now, Bruce Tomlin came up with a really clever idea of asking if these changes in real-time dynamics in SLI are basically like delayed development, right? Are these the same as you would see over development, but delayed? And so we recently ran a group of 28 typically developing adolescents. I think we added 10 more to the pool, but I don't have the data, so I can't show you all of it. My understanding looks the same. At 9 and 16, what are the changes? So remember, this is the sort of pattern with language impairment. They have less looks at peak, right? And you can see our 9 and 16-year-olds don't show that at all. The 9-year-olds are clearly slower, they're significantly slower, but they get to the same level of fixations. And when you look at the cohorts, it's the same thing. They show major differences at peak, but they do fully suppress the words, where LI listeners don't show differences at peak and fail to fully suppress the words. So there's something distinct here that we wouldn't have seen if we didn't look at real-time processing. This aspect of SLI is not as simple as these kids just need more time to develop. So the summary here is that a deficit in lexical competition is associated with SLI, and it takes the form of having too much activation for competitors and not enough for the right word, not enough for the target. The modeling, as well as our behavioral data, suggests this is lexical, not perceptual. It's not that these kids have a hard time encoding the auditory signal, as people like Paula Talal would argue. It's that they're having a hard time sorting out words. And it's really about the dynamics and stability of lexical activation over time. I also showed you, and this was surprising in its own right, that between 9 and 16, word recognition is still developing. Word recognition is such a basic skill. This should be in place by the time you're 2 or 3. And we're still seeing development here. This correlates a lot with what some of Fred Dick is doing with brain imaging, showing major language development in all sorts of different areas of the brain over this exact same window. And so I think this is interesting in and of itself to think how slow and protracted this basic language skill is developing. But I also think it suggests that development affects lexical dynamics, this real-time processing, very different than language impairment. It's not the same. It's not just about learning more. You got to learn something different if you want to fix this. So I'm going to start compiling some of the results of the different groups. What we find here is that language impairment status affects the degree to which you settle on a single interpretation. And development affects the rapidity of forming hypotheses, how quickly you can start to activate words and suppress competitors. Well, what would a perceptual deficit look like? I've been sort of railing on perceptual deficits for SLI. How would that appear in this paradigm? Well, this is where cochlear implant users can help. We know they have a perceptual deficit, particularly adult CI users. They're getting lousy input, right? So we can ask what that would appear like. So Ashley Turnbull and I conducted a study with 29 adult cochlear implant users, lots of normal hearing listeners. These people were all deaf in their 30s, 40s, or later, but none of them were in the age where you'd be talking about cognitive aging. We've got the same sort of design, candle, sandal, sandwich, and so forth, blah, blah, blah. Here are the results. These are the CI users, these are the normal hearing listeners. You can see already a very different pattern here. The CI users face a significant delay. Now they also never quite fixated this much, which is similar to what the LI kids show. You can also see here that they activate rhymes particularly more. They're delayed. If you measure the time of this peak, I know this doesn't look like much, but keep in mind the scale here. This is about 100 milliseconds difference, right? They're delayed on the peak. If you pull this out further, it actually does turn out they do fully suppress the competitors, even though it looks like a late one going on here. And we ran this with normal hearing people listening to simulation, got basically the same thing. So these deficits are probably due to having a degraded input. When the word recognition system gets lousy input, this is what it does. It slows down. And that, of course, has all sorts of interesting cascades throughout the system, but it's basically slowing down. So we see lots of speed manipulations here. We don't see much effect on the amount of peak competition. There's a little bit for the rhymes, but not the cohorts. We got a different pattern. And we get a roughly similar pattern with simulated CI inspiration. So if we add to our pile, we delete our pile. Where's the rest of the pile here? Come on. There we go. Perceptual ability, your ability to hear the fine-grained details of speech, seems to affect the rapidity of forming hypotheses. Kind of like development, which makes me think, is there speech perception development going on this late? And the short answer is there might be. We've got some data on that I'm going to avoid talking about because it's underdeveloped. But there's something similar going on here. Now, what about children who must acquire language with an adverse input, right? This is not the case of the normal language system suddenly getting goofy input. These kids have to figure out what the words are, they have to figure out what the phonemes of their language are from this very degraded input. So we're testing kids as adolescents at this point, but these are all kids that were deafened very early. The mean was 5 months, and they got their implants somewhat early. So these are 40. Remember, if they're 18, we were using the surgical criteria of 12 years ago for these kids. So we weren't implanting them at 1 or 2 like we normally would. They had pretty reasonable language. This is their Peabody Picture Vocabulary score. That's a standard score. 100 is the mean. Average kid, they're okay, right? Compare them with age-matched normal hearing listeners. Same basic paradigm. We see something really interesting here. This is yesterday's result. I looked at this data yesterday. It's very exciting. So you guys can tell me if I'm out to lunch on this. But first of all, if you just look at target goal or rhyme support, you see, boy, they're late. I mean, they're really delayed compared to these groups. They also don't show quite as much competitive recognition. It's like that things are less active for them. And we can look closely at that, and you can see really some striking differences. So this is their ability to activate the target word. This is delayed by over 250 milliseconds. The average duration of our words were about 300, which means these kids are waiting till the end of the word to begin thinking about what it might mean. This is not what the consensus in spoken word recognition is. And so when you get this double whammy, when you get both degraded input, because that slows you down, and development, because that slows you down, and you're developing with degraded input, it changes the processing dynamics dramatically. And that has this cool qualitative difference when you look at the competitors. For children, when you think of looks at the cohort, they show fewer looks to the cohort. Well, why might that be? If you're hearing sandal and you wait till you hear bowl to start to think about what it means, you can already rule out sandwich. You already have enough information, so you never have to activate it as much. However, they have more and longer fixations to the rhyme. Because if you're hearing sandal and you wait, there's never any more information to tell you it's not the rhyme, right? And you never made a strong commitment to that S because you waited. And so, slow is not just slow for these kids. These kids are so slow that the fundamental dynamics of how they are processing speech change in a way that, in some ways, is not consistent with current models of spoken word recognition developed for normal hearing individuals. So, degrading the input has a large effect on time. I actually just said this. If you slow down fixations to the target, that changes the peaks of the competitor, and these kids are so delayed that they challenge the common assumption that word recognition is incremental. And developing under these circumstances is difficult. These kids do have a hard time suppressing competitors, but you can see they still get here zero. That's the difference between cohorts and rhymes, or unrelateds rather. They've suppressed them all the way, but they do struggle with it, right? They show a lot more uncertainty overall, and they show big differences between cohorts and rhymes, which we haven't seen in any of our clinical groups. There's a real qualitative effect here of getting implanted with a cochlear implant early. Now that's not to say we shouldn't do it. These kids do much better, especially if they're in a community that has no deaf culture, with the CI than without. It just means we have to approach treatment and remediation with them very differently. So adding to our pile here, if you've got both perceptual deficits and developmental deficits, and you're developing under those circumstances, it definitely affects the rapidity of forming hypotheses, and this has emergent differences on what competes. So a noisy perceptual input can cascade throughout these processing streams in very unexpected ways. We see in CI users different mechanisms that shape the dynamics of lexical activation than we saw in SLI, but the consequences could be similar. For large periods of time, the system has not settled on one word. It doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter if you gave them 3 seconds that they would, because words don't go that slow, right? At the point in time where language processing occurs in the wild, they've got way too many words out. And particularly for kids, we've been looking for these cognitive processes like executive function, working memory for a while, but we never thought to look at lexical access and sentence processing in terms of predicting outcomes. And I think that's the next step in the cochlear implant world. The broader conclusion here is, though, our study of individual differences as a whole has largely taken an accuracy or deficit model. What is this person good with? What is that person good at? What are they bad at? That sort of thing. But a process-based model, thinking about how they get to that good or bad answer, might tell you something different. Here are all the different patterns of target activation we observed, right? All for 4 groups of people who are pretty good but not great at isolated word recognition. So a range of ERPs and priming. But the point is, we need measures that are real-time and that are tied to processing to get to this next level. And we have to relate them to careful, psychometrically valid measures of outcomes. But the visual world paradigm I should mention can do a lot more than assess just activation processes. We were using it to look at phonological categories. We've looked at to measure the temporal order in words or sensitivity to mispronunciation. There's a lot of things. So if you're interested in developing this, go for it. But talk to me, read the literature. There's a lot of good stuff out there. And the research I've shown you today just reveals that there are individual differences in word recognition, and it precisely characterizes them. But we still have to figure out why and where they come from and how they develop. So now I'm going to ride off into the sunset. It is New Mexico. Actually took this in Arizona, sorry. My first time in New Mexico. Big picture here. Language is clearly dynamic, and listeners' representation of what they hear unfold over time, and that matters. You can't just sort of treat it as noise to covary out. The way that you get to the result can change what the result is. It also suggests mechanisms of language processing that are quite consistent with how the brain processes information. Things like parallel activation, inhibition, and decay, right? This takes us right back to like Patricia Goldman-Verkeek's work on working memory, how that works. And so rather than thinking about language as a bunch of symbols and rules to manipulate, this gives us a view that's more directly tied to neuroscience, and I think that's very valuable. And as a result, understanding language in the brain and in the clinic can be enriched by understanding these dynamics. Now, our ECOG work showed you that lexical dynamics can be observed in direct brain recordings in primary auditory areas. Word recognition and auditory perception are not distinct processes. We used to think in psychology that speech was auditory and word recognition is cognitive. In fact, I got turned down for a job at a university I won't name because I was a speech person and they wanted a cognitive person. And this is consistent with a lot of behavioral studies that use all sorts of real-time measures, including eye tracking, and studies over development showing the same interplay. But it also rules out this very discrete model where you first you find the phonemes, then you activate words. This is all going on simultaneously. This matters when we think about impairment. Real-time measures distinguish a lot of groups that show pretty similar and not great accuracy. So with SLI, we saw differences in competitor suppression at the end. Typical development is about the speed and your ability to rapidly suppress competitors. Adult CI users have much slower lexical access, and as I showed you, pediatric CI users have really a qualitatively different pattern. And that makes me wonder if assessments and interventions that target these processes might be better. And work in my laboratory right now is trying to look at sort of small-scale learning processes where we might be able to increase inhibition between words. Would that help? I don't know. We've got some preliminary results that it might work, not with SLI kids, but with college students, and we can change inhibition. Maybe that's the kind of thing we should be looking at. Methodologically, this is a pretty rich paradigm. This visual world paradigm, as I mentioned, can be used to study every level of language, from auditory processing to discourse, and people have done that. If you can't afford an eye tracker, and you have older skilled computer users, mouse tracking can work quite well as well. You can track the X and Y position of the mouse as they make their decision. And people have extended, particularly mouse tracking, to all sorts of interesting nonverbal abilities, like color perception, reasoning, face processing. I've got some work going on with a clinical psychologist where we're looking at men who support rape as a sort of attitude, and their ability to judge sexual interest from women in real time using mouse tracking. So you can apply this kind of logic to lots and lots of problems. And this is really deeply useful for clinical work. The time course of processing can differ amongst different types of individuals, even as their outcome measures are very similar. And when we think about something like language or nonverbal IQ that's correlated with everything, this is really important. This is highly sensitive to individual differences. We've done test, retest, reliabilities on this. Some of the components of the eye movement record are upwards of 0.7, so that's quite good. And you can take it down as young as 7, and Anne Bernal's group has developed a simplified version of this paradigm that goes as young as 18 months, or perhaps younger if they know any words. And so this is very broadly useful. But at a bigger theoretical conclusion, it also says that when we want to think about development, because these are developmental disorders for the most part, we need to be able to characterize cognitive processing and development in at least 2 time scales. There's the fast real-time processing, which is what I focused on today, right? But the other side of my work is the slower, the long-term, the developmental processing. And I think what I've shown you today is that these interact. What kids do in hundreds of milliseconds changes what they learn and how they develop. And each has their own functional demands. We've been exploring this in lots of different domains now, like in people's use of inferential speech, learning word meanings, or even in motor skill learning. There's some motor skill tasks where we can start to disentangle this stuff. So the big picture is that language is dynamic, but development is slow. And if we want to make headway on developmental differences, we might ask if we should be studying the tortoise or the hare. We should be studying development or processing. But I think that only by studying both can we form a model of developmental change that we can believe in. Thank you very much.